Welcome, everybody. It's an honor to be here. I wanted to start off with this story. Charles Duhigg has this great story in his book, Power of Habit. It's about this guy. So you might recognize this guy because this is Paul O'Neill. Paul O'Neill was the former Secretary of the Treasury. But what you might not know is before Paul O'Neill was Secretary of the Treasury, he was the president of a company called Alcoa. Alcoa is a big steel manufacturer. And at the time when he first came on board, Alcoa wasn't doing too well. In fact, Alcoa was floundering. So Paul O'Neill was supposed to be the guy that was going to turn the entire thing around, right? So at his very first investors meeting, the investors packed the room in high anticipation because they wanted to know what this guy had to say. I mean, what was his plan? You know, he was supposed to be the savior to right this ship. So as Duhigg tells the story, you know, Paul O'Neill comes up to the podium. It's this really dramatic moment, and the audience is waiting with bated breath. And Paul O'Neill says something to this effect. He says, "Ladies and gentlemen, today I want to talk to you about worker safety. Worker safety is going to be the #1 priority at this company going forward." And the audience is shocked, right? They're like, what is this guy talking about? I mean, we have real problems here. I mean, we thought he was going to talk about financials and profit margins and bottom line stuff. And here he is talking about something trivial like worker safety. So they challenged him. They said, "Paul, are you sure you want to be talking about worker safety right now?" And he says, "I don't think you understand me correctly. Worker safety is going to be the #1 priority at this company going forward." And so the story goes, the investors leave the room, you know, thinking Paul O'Neill is crazy. You know, they're calling up their clients, telling them to dump the stock and all this mayhem. So the question is, was Paul O'Neill in fact really crazy? And the answer, if you judge by results, is a resounding no, right? Turns out over the course of his tenure, Alcoa experienced amazing growth. I mean, it was this remarkable transformation story. It's actually one of the reasons he became tapped to become the Secretary of the Treasury, right? So what did Paul O'Neill know that no one else did? Well, if you ask Charles Duhigg, the answer is what he calls a Keystone Habit. So what a Keystone Habit is it's a habit that when you change it, it has cascading effects and changes other habits as well, right? And what Paul O'Neill understood about worker safety is that when you fix worker safety, when you work on worker safety, there's all these other things that have to happen, right? When you focus on worker safety, in order for that to be good, you got to have good communication between the staff and the managers, right? In order for worker safety to be good, you have to be innovative and good problem solving and pay attention to detail and processes. All things that are so important for a steel manufacturing company, right? So Paul O'Neill understood that the worker safety had this disproportionate impact. If they could focus on that, it would create this cascading effect across the entire organization. So I tell you this story for two reasons. The first is because I think meetings, like worker safety, is the ultimate keystone habit in organizations. If we think about meetings, what they are, they're at the intersection of how we communicate, how we collaborate, how we make decisions on the most important issues of the day. So when we talk about meetings, it's not just these 30-minute things that are on our calendar that we attend every single day. What they are is an access to changing the entire organization, to change the way we think and the way we do business. So I think that's important to realize, and I do believe that this culture gets this, right? I mean, your CEO clearly gets it. I mean, Larry Page famously sent out that memo when he first started at Google, or when he first joined as the CEO, and I think that this is, you know, a priority of this company, so that I'm really I feel privileged to be talking to you guys. The second reason I've told you this story is because that's the approach I want to take today. Rather than giving you an entire map of radical overhaul, which sometimes and often fails, what I want to do is just give you 3 specific habits, 3 specific behaviors that are actionable, that seem almost simplistic, but have the potential to have disproportionate impact, right? By changing just these small little things, you'll create cascading effects that might actually change a lot of other things and ultimately the culture. So that's what I want to do. I want to talk about these 3 habits, but I also got to talk about why I'm prescribing these habits. I want to talk about the forces that cause meetings to be broken, all right? So let's talk about the first keystone habit, and I'll explain what it is or why it's there. So we want to identify one decision owner before any decision-oriented meeting convenes. Right? It sounds pretty simple. Key word is before, by the way. Right? And I'll explain that in a moment here. But the reason why this is so effective and so important, because it's so rarely done, is because of something we call a diffusion of responsibility. Right? So this is my poster child for diffusion of responsibility. This is a picture of Parkland Memorial Hospital in Dallas, Texas. It's one of the biggest hospitals in the country. Last year, Parkland had this problem, which is they needed a new CEO. Past CEO had resigned. They needed a new one to take their place. This is a pretty big decision for an organization, right? So Parkland did what you'd imagine any organization they would do. They called a meeting. They got the entire board in a room together, and they asked this question: so what are we going to do? Now that seems like the right approach, right? It seems like the smart thing to do, but there was a problem. 45 minutes into the 90-minute meeting, they had no idea why they were in the room. They had no idea what they were deciding, right? They had no idea what the action items were, right? So 45 minutes into the meeting, somebody made a suggestion. They said, well, why don't we hire an executive search firm? Great idea. They couldn't decide on which firm to hire. So someone else had a brilliant idea. They said, why don't we hire a consultant to help us hire the executive search firm? You didn't hear this wrong. I mean, they were thinking about hiring a consultant to hire a consultant, which I think is absurd, but they thought it was a pretty good idea. But they couldn't even decide on what consultant to hire. So what they did was they ended up appointing a subcommittee to come up with a list of 5 candidates of potential consultants that would be reviewed at the next meeting. And this sounds funny, right? Because it's absurd. One of the things you can do is you can blame the individuals, and trust me, I have. Right? You can blame the individuals in that meeting and say there's something wrong with them. But when you see this, like I have across so many different organizations, all across the country, the world even, you realize that there's something else going on here. There's some social forces at play here. And we know what some of those social forces are, right? The entire field of social psychology is dedicated to kind of these phenomena, right? Bib Latane and John Darley did these famous experiments. You probably know about them, 50 years ago, where they were called smoke-filled room experiments. They'd get students into a room together, right, to take a test. The test was a guise, right, because really what they did was they were pumping smoke into the room while they were taking the test, trying to figure out how long it would take them to report what was supposed to look like a fire. Right? When you had one student in the room, what they found was the performance was fine. Right? One person in the room, about 75% of the time or so, you got students report the fire in a really timely basis. Right? What happens when you put just 2 more people into the room? Performance drops dramatically. You go from 75% of the time to 38% of the time students report the fire. Almost a comical effect. You have students with smoke filling their eyes and they're crying and they're still not reporting this fire. And so we learned something from that experiment, which is that groups are really good at solving problems, but that is not without exception. Right? When responsibility is ambiguous, groups can actually perform abysmally, right? Particularly when we don't understand what the decision is, what we're deciding, and who should be deciding. But think about what we do so often in organizations. Whenever there's a problem, whenever there's ambiguity on what we should be doing, we get into a room together, right, and try to sort it all out. And that's precisely what the diffusion of responsibility wants. It magnifies the effects and we end up doing nothing, or it ends up taking a very long time. Now, if we drill down on this, what we realize is that one of the primary kind of driving forces behind this is social etiquette, right? We all have these social boundaries around us. We hate breaking them, right? You walk into an elevator, everybody's facing in one direction. You don't dare face the other way, right? We know this. In organizations that have kind of clan, communal cultures, flatter organizational structures, we find this even more present, right? Where everybody's equal, so it's hard to really impose yourself. It's hard to own up to a decision. It's hard to take responsibility because we're afraid of infringing on other people's kind of territory and stuff. So what are the consequences of this? Well, we get massive delay, right? A decision that should take 5 minutes takes 5 months, right? A decision that's supposed to take 1 meeting ends up taking 10. Right? We also get compromise, which sometimes is good, but in a world that's blending all together, compromise decisions often get ignored, right? Design by committee often leads to horrible things that we don't want. So we need to figure out how we can kind of solve this diffusion of responsibility problem. Well, what we know is that leadership is the antidote to the bystander effect, right? And that's why decision owner is so important. When someone stands up, it breaks the force field. We all know, for example, when you're on a subway car and there's a panhandler, and they might do a good performance, and everybody wants to give, but nobody does, right? Because nobody else is giving, right? But we all know what happens when one person gives. When one person gives, the force field is broken, and then everyone gives. By the way, panhandlers have gotten really smart. They've worked in pairs. They get a confederate to be the first one that gives, and that starts the process. Well, we can do the same thing. And that's why this idea of making sure that we have a decision owner, an explicit decision owner, before we get into the room has cascading effects. If we have a decision owner, we have accountability. If we have accountability, we're going to clarify the decision. If we clarify the decision, then we know what decision we're making and we can actually make it. Right? And the key word here, like I alluded to before, is the word before. It has to happen before we get into the room. Because if we wait until we get into the room to decide on who's the decision owner, we're already in the matrix. We've already lost the game because we've already succumbed to the diffusion of responsibility. The second keystone habit that I want to talk about is this idea of replacing meetings with one-on-one conversations. So not all meetings, by the way, but I don't even call one-on-one conversations meetings, right? I think they're fundamentally different than what we traditionally think of as meeting, right? So what's the impetus for this, right? Well, it's this idea that some of you are probably familiar with. It's the idea of the tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is a parable, which I'll share with you. So, 8 farmers share this plot of land, right? That's how they make their livelihood. They allow their cows to graze, and that's how they make their living. Well, these farmers have a short-term problem and a long-term problem. Long-term problem is obvious, right? If too many cows are allowed to graze the grass, then the grass is ruined for everyone. And no farmer wants that, right? But there's a short-term problem faced by each individual farmer. It's a little bit less obvious, but it's actually more interesting. And that individual dilemma is this. If I'm one of the farmers, I'm thinking to myself, well, I know I'm not supposed to have one more cow in the grass, but if I did, I would get all the benefits of that cow, but everybody else would have to share the costs. Now that asymmetry is a pretty irresistible deal, right? And so what happens is farmers end up taking it, right? And if one farmer does it, every farmer does it. And so what you end up happening is 1, 2, 3 more cows for everyone. And the reason why the tragedy of the commons is a tragedy is because farmers end up working in their selfish short-term interests at the expense of the long-term interests of the group. Now this is a widely known social phenomenon. We see this in overfishing, we see this in pollution. I'm going to argue we see this right here in the organization, right? Because if you think of how a meeting works so often, right? Somebody who calls a meeting, let's say I call a meeting of 8 people for 1 hour. Well, I get 8 hours of productivity from the people in that room, and I only have to spend 1 hour myself. Right? That's a pretty irresistible deal, right? It's one that's easy to exploit. I'm not saying that people do this intentionally or nefariously, but it happens, and we have to realize that that is going to create a problem. It's going to create a system where you have tons and tons of meetings, and that's what happens. I call it the tragedy of the calendar, right? That's why I talk to organizations all the time, and this is what people's calendars look like, and it's largely because of this phenomenon. I think that one of the reasons, the justifications for this is something that isn't talked about, but especially in hierarchical organizations, it's almost assumed. And I think we should talk about the justification because I think it's a bad justification. I don't think it makes mathematical sense. And what that justification is if you're in a big organization, the people higher up the food chain will say, hey, listen, off the record, they say, well, listen, my time is extremely valuable, and I need to do this sometimes. If it takes me 5 hours to write a memo, that's not good for me. It might be advantageous for the organization if I can get people in a room together and kind of use their time instead of mine. They won't say it that way, but that's kind of the implicit justification. And I'm going to argue that that is the wrong justification because let's look at the extreme of that example. Who has the most expensive time in the world? Who's got the most valuable time in the world? I would argue it's the President of the United States. Right? It turns out that the President of the United States every morning since I think 1947 has received this report, which is the Presidential Daily Briefing. It's a report of the day's intelligence, right? And this report corresponds with a meeting that follows it, right? Most times you have a meeting that follows it where you discuss the report. Well, there's one president in particular, which is George W. Bush. I'm not picking on anybody politically here, but this just happens to be factual, that George W. Bush didn't want to read the memo beforehand. He actually showed up to the meeting and preferred that he be briefed in person. So the first 15, 20 minutes of the meeting or so was spent actually orally briefing the president on what was already in this memo. You think to yourself, if anybody could justify this, it's the President of the United States, right? It's the person who's got the most valuable time in the world where we're trying to maximize his time. But then you think to yourself, who else is in that meeting? And it turns out the other people in that meeting are the top of the top CIA officials. Top of the CIA and Department of Defense. I mean, these are the people that have the second most valuable time in the world, right? And that's why this justification doesn't work, because if you think about, relatively speaking, the people we have meetings with are people who have similar valuable time as we do. So the consequences of this is you get, like we said, tons of meetings that are often one-sided. You go into a meeting sometimes, you feel like, wow, that was a waste of my time. And you were right, because it was intended that way. And we need to fix this. We need to stand up and realize that although this happens, and implicitly, it's not the way that an organization should run. So the question is, how do we fix it? Right? Well, in the example of the tragedy of the commons with the farmer parallel, the parable, one of the things you can do is you separate the plot of land into 8 separate plots, right? Because what you're trying to do is you're trying to fix this asymmetry problem, right? If each individual farmer has his own plot, what happens is that every cow now that I let onto the grass, I get all the benefits, but I also share the costs. Well, what's the equivalent in the organization? Well, the answer is the one-on-one conversation. The one-on-one conversation is an amazing tool, right? Because it's unlike a meeting, it's really personal, it's direct, it's free from groupthink. But the other great thing about a conversation is it's beautifully symmetrical. I spend 1 hour, you spend 1 hour, right? And this reduces the incentives of the meeting or the tragedy of the commons effect. So I think we need to switch to one-on-one conversations as kind of the primary fuel. Not to say that we can do everything that way, but a lot of meetings we can do as one-on-one conversations. And that produces amazing cascading effects. Because when you use one-on-one conversations, you're forced to think really hard about who you're having these conversations with. Because now, instead of using the meeting as this weapon of mass interruption, where you get 8 people in a room together and it's easy for you, try having 8 one-hour conversations with people. It's not as easy, right? So there's friction. It improves the quality of the conversations, and it reduces the quantity, and that creates a culture that's free from interruption, or where there's less interruption. Final Keystone Habit, and then I want to move into some question and answer. Make all standing meetings tentative, right? So what that means is that any standing meeting, any regularly occurring meeting, does not exist unless we initiate it every single time, right? So I'll concede that sometimes maybe you want to have a regular meeting, and you can carve out time with your team, right, where there might be a meeting. But every week before that meeting meets, so it's got to be initiated. The default should be no meeting. And the reason why this is so crucial and why this specific small habit has disproportionate impact is something I call meeting institutionalization. The meeting has become this kind of this institution, right? Great example is with NASA. So I did some work with NASA, who are brilliant, by the way, and great folks. But one of the groups I worked with, they have this meeting that they have every single week. It's called the ICB meeting. The Internal Control Board meeting is what they call it. And it's a very important thing. They spend a lot of time making sure that this is we're talking about the right things. But there's problems with that meeting. They go on too long. There's too many things that are discussed. And I interviewed some people beforehand. I said, what's the purpose of this meeting? And no one can really give me a clear answer. They say, well, it changes all the time, and it's kind of difficult to explain. And then I said, well, if you don't know what the purpose is, why don't you get rid of it? And they gasped. I mean, they almost threw me out of the room, right? I'm kidding. They're wonderful people. But they couldn't even fathom the idea of getting rid of this thing, right? I'm not saying they should have. I just said, why don't you consider it? And the reality is, it was clear to me that this meeting was no longer a meeting; it was an institution, right? See, the meeting is supposed to be this tool, right? You start out with a problem and you say, okay, what is the meeting the right tool to fix this problem, right? Maybe it's email. Email is another tool. But that's not what happens very often. What happens often is we start with the meeting and we say, okay, what problems do we fix at the meeting, right? That's what was happening with the Internal Control Board meeting. Every week, they had this question, which is, what do we need to talk about at this meeting? And this backwards justification creates a lot of problems, right? It creates what I call the CNN problem, right? CNN has this problem, 24 hours, they need 24 hours of news every single day, no matter what, right? What happens on a day where there is no news? That's when you see stories about cats, right? Stories about otters that they taught to play basketball, which is adorable, by the way. But it's not news, right? But that's what happens when the meeting becomes an institution and you backwards justify, you end up talking about trivial things or things that you wouldn't otherwise talk about if you had started the other way around. Now, the interesting thing is, this is not a phenomenon we see, for example, in email, right? Email is another tool, but we don't see this phenomenon really often in email. And I think the reason is because meetings are a social event, right? And social events get ritualized, and if you're not careful, they get institutionalized. Right? So this is a great example. This is the State of the Union. So State of the Union, which I love, by the way. I mean, I'm a geek. I love watching the State of the Union. But the reality is, most people don't know that before the State of the Union was this big live address, it was a memo. For the longest amount of time, the President wrote the State of the Union, and he sent it out to Congress. Right? And somewhere along the way, I forget when it was, I think 50 or 60 years ago, they started doing it at this live address, right? It was easy to go from that memo to meeting, but it's almost impossible to go from the meeting back to the memo, right? Because now when you think of State of the Union, it's synonymous with meeting, right? We can't even think of the State of the Union without the meeting. If you propose to somebody, you say, hey, I think maybe we should go back to a memo, they're going to think that you are committing treason. They think that you want to get rid of the State of the Union altogether, right? Because they can't fathom it as a memo. And that's what happens when the meeting becomes institutionalized, and we have to be careful of that. So the reason why we want to make all standing meetings tentative is because we want to start the process of deinstitutionalizing the meeting, right? This is just one small way to do it, right? Because if every single week, like if it's a weekly meeting, and every single week you have to, somebody has to initiate the meeting, right? It's on the calendar, but unless somebody stands up and says, we should have this meeting, it doesn't exist. Well, then you have this problem, which is somebody has to put themselves on the line, and somebody has to justify this meeting's existence every single time. It may be a formality, right? You may still have the meeting, but at least you have some accountability, and you have this sense that there is a purpose to this meeting, right? A meeting is a form, it's not a function, right? So these are the 3 keystone habits that I think, they're not the only habits, but they're a really great way to make a huge dent in the culture, right? Because remember, all a culture is it's a collection of habits, right? It's a collection of way people think and the way people behave, right? And the greatest thing I think about meetings is that they're the perfect marketing tool, right? The great thing about it's a viral phenomenon, right? You cannot have meetings without other people, right? So if it sounds daunting to change an entire department or entire organization, but just focus on your corner of the world. Focus on the meetings that you have. Focus on the meetings you attend. Try to change those, because if you do, there's a chance that it might spread. And when habits spread, that's how cultures change. Well, thank you for listening to the presentation part of this. I'd love to take some questions. Yes?
Sometimes the difficulty is you're trying to get a decision maker in the room, and for whatever reason they're not available, and or originally they said they would make it and they can't make it, or something like that. How do you address that?
Well, I think that's why making it explicit is really important. So first of all, let's distinguish decision maker from decision owner. Because I like the term decision owner because it implies that that person could be the decision maker, but he doesn't necessarily have to be the decision maker. So for example, I know one of the Google creeds is to strive for consensus, which is important, and I think that's usually a good thing. So a decision owner can say, I'm not the decision maker in this case. What I am is I'm the kind of the conduit. We're going to decide this by group consensus, and if consensus can't be reached, then I become the unilateral decision maker. Okay. The other thing about decision owner is there's no bones about it. You own the decision, right? It's a kind of this territorial phenomenon that is really important. And the reason why making it explicit is really important is because as soon as you become the decision owner, you can't even dream of not being at the meeting where this is being talked about, right? Because you're the decision owner. How are you not at that meeting, right? So it's this framing problem that we're creating for that person. And so way before the decision even happens, we need to figure out, okay, who is the owner? Who is the person, for all intensive purposes, is responsible for making this decision, right? Which is a great time to talk about it, because the further you are away from the actual decision, the less anxious people are, the less afraid people are of taking responsibility. So if you catch people in the very beginning and make sure that they sign their name as a decision owner, well, now you have some accountability, and it's going to be way easier to get that person involved. Yes?
What are your thoughts on the value that, like, for example, my team, we have a weekly meeting where we just talk about what we've worked on the week, and there's oftentimes no real purpose or nothing particular that I want to say here. But through those conversations, sometimes something good comes out. You know, we didn't really have a goal, but why not somebody else working on something that, you know, contribute to or something like that. How does that work with the idea of, you know, always like making sure there's a purpose for moving forward?
Well, so there's two things. The first is I think that those typical kind of staff status meetings, we might call them, or something, the one thing that's clear to me is that they should be optional, right? I understand there's value to these types of meetings, right? But as we learned from, for example, Susan Cain's book, Quiet, that there are different type of people, right? They're introverts, they're extroverts. People are creative differently, people are productive differently. You know, an introvert, for example, might not want to attend the meeting, right? It might be more beneficial for them just to stay in their pod and just do work during that time and not be interrupted. And so I don't know if it's beneficial to kind of force people to come to the meeting if they don't want to be there. So I think the first step is to make them optional. Because the reality is, whether we force people or not, the presumption in organizations is usually, the implicit contract is, you're coming to the meeting. Like if I invite you, you got to come, right? It's almost like being subpoenaed to testify at court. It's like punishable by jail time if you don't go. That's usually the ethos in an organization. The other thing is, I agree that this is kind of a indirect way to answer your question, which is that the term collaboration is almost meaningless now. It's virtually a meaningless word because we don't know exactly what we mean or what we talk about. So people always, one of people's objections is always, well, meetings are a great collaborative tool. You come into a room, you rub elbows with people, there's all these ideas, and there might be some type of spark of inspiration or creativity or some overlap that will get us to, for me to be more productive. And that's valid. That's a valid concern. But there's millions of different types of collaboration, right? There's indirect collaboration where you go into a room and you brainstorm and somebody kind of gets some idea out of something. But then there's the direct collaboration where you go into a room and, like a writer and an editor, you give somebody an idea and you say, hey, what's my feedback on this, right? And I guess what I'm saying, this is a circuitous way of saying that we need to figure out what exactly we're aiming for here, right? So if you invite people into a status meeting for the hope that there's going to be some collisions, there might be better ways to do that. An asynchronous collaboration tool in the cloud, which you guys are so really good at, that oftentimes yields more of those types of collisions, right? Sometimes it can be the in-person meetings. I don't know, but the answer is we have to design these meetings and these sessions with a purpose in mind. And the accidental phenomenon, I don't think is a really good justification, because there's always an opportunity cost. It's a really expensive way to deal with some of these problems. So you gotta just do a kind of a cost-benefit analysis.
How do you feel about banning people from doing stuff on their laptops during meetings?
I think that all laptops should be out of the room. Unless there's a real specific. You guys are obviously technology companies, so you guys may take notes on laptops and stuff like that. But so for this culture, that might be kind of heresy. But like, for example, I did a training for some folks at one of these Fortune 500 organizations, and before and I had a little tray outside, and before they came in, we literally confiscated their phones and their laptops and all that, all their electronic devices. And I can get away with that because that's kind of my shtick and stuff, you know. I'm not saying that's exactly what you should be doing, but you should think about it, because one of the things that does is it sends a signal, right? It may do nothing else but just send a signal that this is a different type of meeting, right? When you come in this room, we're actually going to do business. We're going to talk about important stuff. We're not going to get distracted. And the goal is to get out of this room as quickly as possible. If we can do this in 20 minutes instead of 60 minutes, let's do it. And so one of the things I think we need to do as meeting facilitators and leaders is send these signals to people to make sure that they understand that this is a different type of meeting. And so that's kind of one way to do that. But you know, if it's not a problem, it's not a problem. If it is, you know, confiscate.
Do you make any kind of distinction between meetings and brainstorming sessions, which, you know, as people, you get an email like, hey, let's all get into this room and brainstorm about this. And of course, it looks exactly like a meeting on your calendar, but the purpose is
That's a great question.
something different. But a lot of times, because there's no owner in the brainstorming session, or nobody's prepared anything in advance, just bleh.
It's a great question. I realize I'm supposed to be repeating these questions. He asked about the difference between a meeting and a brainstorm. So one of the things that I think we've failed at is to kind of distinguish different types of meetings. You know, just like I said that collaboration, you know, that word is kind of virtually meaningless. So is the word meeting. I mean, we call everything a meeting. I mean, is this a meeting? You know, I went to one of these conferences, I spoke at with like a lot of people at it. They call those meetings. The people who plan those meetings are called meeting planners. So, you know, we just have this horrible vocabulary when it comes to meetings. So one of the things I do in my book, not enough of, but I do it in my work, is kind of distinguishing what are these different type of sessions called and what are the corresponding purposes. So when you think about brainstorms, for example, brainstorms are very different than what I would think of as a traditional meeting, right? I think meetings are about reducing and coming to decisions. Brainstorms are the opposite. They're about imagination and actually generating a lot of possibilities and options. But like to your point, you know, if I'm walking down the hall and you know I see in the conference room, I can't tell whether you're doing a meeting or a brainstorm. That's a problem, right? So one of the corollaries to that is that, you know, when we think about problem solving, we usually try to do both at the same time. But like if you're a writer, for example, and you're a productive writer, every productive writer usually knows that you can't write and edit at the same time. You try to come up with a lot of stuff and edit at the same time, you're going to end up with nothing. But that's how we approach problem solving a lot of times, right? We try to come up with a lot of options at the same time we try to delete them. So I say let's have the brainstorm, the first part of the problem solving phase where you just generate a lot of options, and then the second phase is the meeting where we traditionally reduce the options and come to a decision. It doesn't always work that clean, but we should ideally separate those two. And we should organize the session in a way that lends itself to those things, right? So if we organize a brainstorm, we should make sure that people are active. We should make sure that, you know, like take a page from IDEO. You know, IDEO is the best brainstorming company in the world, arguably. You guys might be the second, third, I don't know. What they do is they have Post-its all over the place. You know, they have, you know, they're active, they're up, they're all over the place. I mean, if you just visually, if you look at what they're doing, it's just very different than what most of corporate America does. So, you know, I think let's not even call them the same thing. Let's distinguish the two and kind of organize them in a way that serves their function. Yeah.
Sort of on that same point, I've heard there sometimes is value in holding certain types of meetings in other places. So if this is like a conference room where we have certain types of meetings, like a brainstorming session might always be done in a different kind of room, a specific place where people sort of mentally attach that's where you go to brainstorm. Maybe it's all whiteboards or whatever.
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. I mean, basically you're trying to get people to stop filtering, you know? We're filtering every single day in every single meeting. You know, we're watching what we say, we're watching what we even think. And so anything you can do to kind of change, to anchor people to a different emotional state is really good. I mean, that's why offsites work really well. You take somebody up to, a resort or a cabin in the county, they're probably going to be more creative, right? Because the culture is different, the environment is different. I mean, we can't always go to an offsite, but we can do that in the organization. We can have a separate room dedicated to brainstorming. We can kind of make organize the room differently. These are all things that really promote creativity. I believe that. Yeah.
I think to follow up a little bit on what you said about bringing laptops to meetings, like I sometimes find that, I'm invited to let's say an hour-long, sync up meeting, where there's maybe like 2 minutes on the agenda that actually have anything to do with me. But rather than there's like social pressure to go. So I would, typically rather bring my laptop and continue to do work and wait for someone to say something that has something to do with me rather than not show up to the meeting at all. I don't know if you have any thoughts about that.
Well, I mean, I think that's justified, but let's get to the root of the problem. Let's get to the root of the problem. I mean, why are you in the meeting to begin with? Let's get you out of the meeting, Like if you don't need to be there, then you shouldn't be there. You should be productive by yourself. I mean, one of the things, there's this great article, maybe some of you have read it, by Paul Graham, who's a big, he founded Y Combinator, he's big in the startup world, and he wrote this article called The Difference Between Managers versus Makers and Why Meetings Are So Contentious. I'm getting some head nods here. Because managers and makers have just these two completely different worldviews when it comes to meeting. I mean, managers' days are broken up into kind of hourly slots, right? Because they're used to going from meeting to meeting to meeting, right? So they're used to the meetings. They probably even enjoy meetings. Makers, on the other hand, programmers, engineers, artists, they don't work that way. I mean, they need long stretches of time to do their work. So when they get invited to a meeting, it's like you've shot their entire day. One meeting, 30 minutes, and their entire day's productivity is lost. And a manager doesn't understand that because they don't share that worldview, right? So it's important, I think, in organizations, right, in competitive organizations, to realize that we need to make sure that we fill that communication gap, right? Because in a world where makers are so important, we need creativity, we need productivity, and people are just willfully going to these meetings even though they're not being productive. We need to stop that. We need to start organizing our work habits in a very different way. A manager might need to start having simple one-on-one conversations with their engineers and their programmers, right? Maybe they have an office hours, right? Maybe it's an office hours format where between 2 and 4, you can stop in any time you want for 10 minutes with them. I don't know what the answer is, but the first step is the dialogue. Unless we talk about this, and I know it's tough because these are our bosses and the people above us, but there are companies that are doing it, and they're winning because they're changing the culture, and so we need to do that too. Any other questions?
What about quarterly status updates, by which I mean things that, first of all, very virtualized must happen every quarter, and some manager organizes an entire agenda, which involves basically presentations to the organization. And at the beginning of a quarter, it seems as though these happen on every level of the hierarchy. So yeah, the first week or two of the quarter is lost in these meetings.
I mean, the question was about quarterly status meetings. And I'm very skeptical of any meeting that meets with regularity, right? Because again, a meeting is supposed to be designed as a tool to fix a problem. A regular meeting presupposes that there's some type of problem that just comes up consistently every single quarter for some reason. And I don't know that to be the case. So I'm not saying we shouldn't have them, but the first thing we should do is be skeptical of them and say, well, why exactly is that there? And we need to work backwards. We need to say, okay, well, what is this for? Not backwards, forwards. We need to figure out what's the problem, what are we trying to solve, and is this the right way to do it? What exactly is this status meeting for? I mean, presentations, there's lots of ways to do presentations, right? I mean, you guys have pioneered some of them, right? You can videotape it, you can put it on YouTube, and you can send it out to everyone, right? One of the reasons why we do presentations in front of everybody is to make sure everybody comes, right? Because we're afraid if we do a presentation online and they don't watch it, or they're not going to watch it. And that's a Band-Aid. There's some fundamental problem if people aren't watching the presentation, right? I mean, just forcing people into a room to watch your presentation is not a good practice no matter where you are. So again, I think that whenever there's some type of meeting with some type of regularity, we should be suspicious. We can really try to figure out what the meeting is for, and if there's no good purpose, then we should just not do it. Okay, well listen, I really am honored to have spoken here today. I'll be around for a little while, so if you have any questions, I'd love to answer them, but thank you very much.